It's good. Hello. So I'm an impatient guy, so naturally when it comes to sanding in the past, I've ruined a couple of projects. So let's start with the sanders. There are multiple different types of sanders, but for 90% of my projects, I use a random orbital sander. And as you can see, I have two of them. One with a 5-inch stroke size and the other one with a 2.5-inch stroke size. And the big one is perfect to use with a lower grit sandpaper to remove a lot of material. And the smaller one is mostly used for finer detail and fine grit paper. And the random orbital sander both rotates and vibrates at the same time, leaving a finish mostly without sand marks. I'm not going to go more into detail about the sander, but if you want to get a sander, I would go for a random orbital one. Next, let's talk about the paper. There's a multitude of different types of sandpaper, and trying out different papers has been the best for me. I just buy a set of papers, try them out. If I don't like them, I don't buy them again. I buy another set, try them out, and so on until I find the paper I really like. Recently, I've been using the 3M extract paper. I really like it, it's good. I'm gonna keep buying that one. All right, so we have the sander, we have the paper, and we have some material. Now let's talk about how to sand this properly. Now, when I want to sand this pine board, I'm gonna start with an 80 grit paper. If you just jump that part and go straight to 120 or 180 paper, it will of course take more time sanding. But skipping grits can also leave sand marks that will be hard to get through. And a good tip here is not to increase your paper by more than 50%. That means that the next paper after 80 is 120. And after that 180 and so on. Now my main issue in the past was that I never knew where I had sanded. So you need to be very methodical. You can also use the pen trick. Simply scribble all over the surface lightly and then you sand away. Still, you should do it methodically. Once you've gone over the item and most of the pen marks are gone, you can just scribble again and repeat this procedure until you remove all the sand marks in one sanding round. You should not just try to remove every bit of pen mark, because if you've gone over the board methodically, the pen marks that are left only indicates that the board isn't perfectly flat. So scribble again until you remove all the pen marks in one go. And please don't tilt the machine. It will only create dents. Now, before we swap out the paper to 120, we have an important step. And that is to remove all the dust from the surface. Otherwise, those dust particles left on the board will cause marks when using the higher grit sandpaper. So I usually use my air compressor just to clean it off. Now, the higher grit paper you use, the lighter the wood will become when adding the finish. And that's because the finish won't penetrate as much. And then one thing you can do before you go at your surface with the last grit sandpaper is water popping. That means wiping off the wood with some water. And when you do that, you will notice that the grain stands up. And by doing this now means it won't happen when you add your finish. So you add some water with a damp rag, then you sand it off with your last sand grit paper, and then you can add your finish. Another thing that can ruin your sanding is not having proper dust collection. Not only does it prevent you from just breathing in the dust, but it also helps the sanding. Because without dust collection, there's a good chance the paper will clog. And that will also leave marks in the wood. Talking about clogging, sometimes you want to remove a finish on wood, and the paper just eventually clogs. That is because the finish is overheating and clogging the paper. And one thing you can do to try to remedy that is reducing the speed of the sander. I usually don't use the speed control on the sander, but for removing old material, it's actually pretty handy. So I'm definitely not an expert on sanding stuff, but I have done these mistakes in the past. And by just being methodical and using the pen trick and water popping the wood, you will get a perfectly nice finish. Just let me... Another important part is of course to use a face mask. some kind of protection. And yes, the beard actually prevents a really tight seal, so you could potentially shave if you want to. I don't want to. Oh, and also don't put a lot of pressure when sanding, because that will prevent the random orbital sander from vibrating or rotating as it should. So how do I know what grit sandpaper to use? Well, it usually says on the label on the finish you're using what the last grit of sandpaper should be. So all the items I've used in this video are down in the description of the video. I hope you enjoyed this episode, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Bye.